What does it mean to be flood fluent? We're going to find out on today's show. We're joined now by Ben McFarlane, who is a senior regional planner with the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. And Ben, thanks for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, we are in hurricane season, and that tends to mean we think about a lot of different things. And flood insurance may not be something that jumps high to on the top of people's list, but it's certainly something very important, and that's really what we're here to talk about getting our residents to be flood fluent, I think is how the website is geared toward.
That's right.
So when we talk about flood insurance, really, what are we talking about with that?
So flood insurance is, for most people in this country, there's a very small private flood insurance market. So most people, when we get flood insurance policies, it's through the National Flood Insurance Program. So it's a separate policy from your homeowners or your renters or your business insurance. Most of those insurance policies explicitly do not cover damage from flooding. So if you're at all concerned about your property being damaged from flooding, getting a flood insurance policy through the National Flood Insurance Program is the best way to do that.
And is that one, you already hit on it, but is that one of the big misconceptions? Well, I have homeowners, I've got my renter's insurance, I'm set, I'm good to go, but not the case.
That's right, yeah, absolutely. That is one of the biggest issues in the United States in terms of people's understanding about the risk of flooding and what is covered and what's not. And many decades ago, the private insurance market decided to get out of the flood insurance game entirely, and that's why it's been left up almost entirely to the National Flood Insurance Program. So yes, absolutely. The only way to guarantee you're covered for a flood event is to get a flood insurance policy.
And if people think, well, look, I've been in my house 10, 15 years, it's never flooded here. I don't have a river nearby. I don't have some kind of body of water that's going to do something. But I think the theory is if it rains where you are, you can flood.
Absolutely, yeah. So in Hampton Roads, we have a wide range of types of communities and different, we're all kind of close to the water. Some are closer than others. But certainly, even if you're not right next to the coast, doesn't mean that you're not vulnerable to flooding. And in some cases, if you haven't been flooding, you've been there for 15 or 20 years, then certainly, good for you, and you've been lucky in a lot of respects. Right. But the figures that they show is that if you live in the 1% floodplain anyway, so it's a 1% chance per year, but it's about a 26% chance over the course of a 30-year mortgage. So if you think about, how long you might live in one place. You might not get flooded this year. You might not get flooded next year, but you don't know when it'll hit. So having that insurance coverage is the best way to make sure that if it does happen, you will be covered.
And it only takes one event. I mean, everybody thinks, we have a storm that comes through. Well, that one wasn't as bad as this one, or the 100-year flood and things like that. But as you said, if you have a 1% chance, but if you extrapolate that over multiple years, that percentage goes up with the likelihood that you're going to have some type of flooding occurrence in some way, shape, or form, correct?
Right, yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind with those maps, the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency publishes flood insurance rate maps. So that's when we talk about the special flood hazard area or the 1% annual chance. Those are taken from those map products that FEMA puts out. But in Hampton Roads, one of the issues that we have is, and actually nationwide, those maps don't tell the whole story. So just because you're not in a flood zone on that map doesn't mean you're not vulnerable to flooding. Even if you're in a low-risk zone, for the most part, the maps here are based on coastal flooding events. Right. Rainfall does not factor into most of those maps. And so what we've seen here in Hampton Roads, unfortunately, over the last several years is that many people have experienced flooding from rain events, not from coastal flooding. Right. And that can come as a complete shock to people because you may not live next to the water, right, and your house is still flooding. Most of our rules are designed to protect against floodplains, flooding happening in floodplains that are based on those maps. So if we don't know that they're at risk of flooding, it's much harder for us to plan ahead of time. And so that's why having flood insurance as a backup is a great way for people to protect themselves and their property.
With looking at the map, I don't know if the average person can disseminate. I mean, certainly they can see maybe where the zone delineation may be. But as far as understanding, like you said, if there's a property nearby or something that you may be kind of linked in an indirect way in the event that an incident would occur, more so than really just, okay, you're in this zone or you're in that zone when it comes to as far as what type of level of coverage or what kind of risk really you may be at. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that those maps were not designed to convey risk. They were designed to help manage an insurance program based on regulations from the federal government. So with those maps, what happens is that they are drawing a line to separate out what has to be covered versus what may not be as much risk. But there's no, so in the real world, you have a gradient of risk, right? There's some risk everywhere for flooding. But that whole story is not reflected in those maps. And so when you look at the map, you may think, okay, well, I'm not in the zone, therefore I don't need flooding or flood insurance. And that's absolutely not true.
Correct.
So those maps they just don't tell the whole story. They can't. So they shouldn't be interpreted as telling that whole story.
How often are those maps updated, and what kind of goes into that process?
Sure, that's a great question, and unfortunately the answer is not often enough, and it varies from community to community. Our last significant update in this area was around 5 years ago. And so what happens is that they'll take in new data for, some of the bigger improvements have been in elevation data. Maybe disappointed to hear this, but a lot of those flood maps are based on very coarse, rough elevation data that may date back decades. And so we have much better tools now to go out and get a sense of exactly how high the land is, but better models for modeling how wind and water happens and it moves around during a storm event. But in terms of the actual kind of update process, there's no rhyme or I won't say that. There's no set schedule for how often they would get updated. But fortunately, we have, in the last 5 years, we've gotten some newer maps that have helped to kind of expand our understanding of what's at risk, but they're not perfect. And in some ways, they're almost out of date as soon as they're published.
Right. Kind of like behind the computer and you turn it on and it's 10 years old by that point almost already. When it comes to making the map, does it require sort of the boots on the ground theory or philosophy behind it, or is it all kind of data-driven, kind of, if you will, done on a computer rather than in person as far as any kind of input in that capacity? Or does it maybe something pops up in the data and the creation of that, someone says, we need to send someone out to go check on it? Is there any field work involved?
So that's a great question. There isn't, so I don't know exactly how they make the maps,
right, okay.
But they do, so they start out with a data-driven mapping process. So they have storm models and they have other data that they combine together to get a sense of kind of how high the water will get under certain circumstances, and then where will that water actually end up going. So that's the standard process. Communities do have an opportunity to petition for changes to the maps. So a lot of that field work is probably more often done by individual property owners, developers, locality governments, as opposed to FEMA coming down and checking their own work.
Got it.
They put out the maps, and then there's a process for amending those maps. If a homeowner is certain that their property is not in the flood zone, they can get a surveyor to come out and actually measure, and survey the property,
right.
And then they submit that through a letter of map amendment to FEMA to get that property removed from the floodplain.
Got it. So the appeal is, again, not done necessarily on the local level. You're appealing to FEMA, which may maybe have a regional or local office in some respects, but really that's where they appeal, or that's where I want to kind of not change this, but I see it differently than you do, kind of a perspective, whereas you said FEMA's kind of putting it out there saying, okay, react to what we've done, so to speak, and then we get your feedback, and then they kind of evaluate it from there, correct?
There is a process, when they first come up with the maps, they're considered draft maps, and FEMA will present those with the community at a community meeting. So they'll work with the local government and the state agency as well. So in Virginia, the Department of Conservation and Recreation has a division of floodplain management that will work with FEMA on those maps. So there's a process to kind of have some initial reactions before they become official maps, but at the point once they become official, that's when that other process takes place where individuals can petition for changes. And that really would go from you have your individual, you'd want to work with your local government folks, your department, your planning department, or your floodplain manager at the local level, and they would work with the folks up at DCR, and then also work up with FEMA. So it's a whole bureaucratic process. It probably takes a lot longer than it should, but there's just check boxes you got to check, and I's you got to dot, and T's you got to cross, things like that.
Well, I know this is certainly not a segment just about mapping. We also wanted to really talk about the Get Fluent website and really the tools that are there. Talk to us a little bit about what people can find there and really what the purpose of the site is from your perspective.
Sure. So getfloodfluent.org is our regional outreach campaign to get people in Hampton, to educate people, provide them more information about the risk of flooding and why flood insurance is really one of the best ways that they can protect themselves. So we've got some information on there about just the general risk of flooding, why we're vulnerable, why you may be more vulnerable than you think. We try to have it be kind of informative and fun at the same time, a little bit of fun,
Right.
and there to kind of engage people.
Sure.
This is not necessarily, certainly, like any topic, you could get it down into the weeds, and we could talk for hours about the mapping nuances, right?
Sure.
But at the core of it, it's really that, we're at risk, and flood insurance is an important way to mitigate that risk at the personal level. And so what we have a quiz you can take to see kind of how much what your baseline level of flood risk and flood insurance is. And then we also have a number of other kind of sections of the site that can point you into specific directions of what you can do as a homeowner or even a renter or a business owner.
Right. Now, I know one of the things you can certainly go on there and figure out where you fall as far as in the flood zone,
Mm-hmm.
correct? Put in your address, pulls it up. What are the things people need to be looking at other than just where their, how their property is described? I mean, what anything else to look at as far as maybe neighboring just on their own part when they go on there for the first time and go, that's where I am, and how it fits into this kind of the realm when we're talking about flooding or potential flooding?
Sure. So we have we've just rolled out this year what we're calling it's a flood risk calculator tool, and the point of this is to kind of reduce the amount of work that individuals have and the amount of effort it might take them to get a sense of how vulnerable they are, and also how much a flood insurance policy might cost for them. And the good news is for a lot of people, particularly those that aren't required by the terms of their mortgage to get a flood insurance policy, it's a lot cheaper than you think
Sure.
it might be. But the first step to that is knowing what your baseline level of risk is. That's that level of risk of which flood zone you're in according to those flood insurance maps. That's really the first driver from FEMA's perspective of how much you may pay for a flood insurance policy. And so the first step we do have a map application on the website. So you'll go in, you type in your address, and what I would want people to take away from that is that don't just look at your house, but look nearby. Those maps, they're drawn with very fine lines. And I like to say that they really should be drawn with very fat markers, right? Because the line of demarcation is not as precise as we would want it to be.
Sure.
And so you can see kind of where you are, look and see kind of where your neighborhood is, because you might see there might be a floodplain a block over.
Right.
If there's a creek or a storm canal or something like that's behind a row of houses in your neighborhood, that could be a potential source of flooding. So kind of getting not just your individual properties location and exact kind of circumstances, but the broader neighborhood as well. One of the things we're also talking about at the PDC, though, is not just vulnerability of flooding to your property, but also how do you get around the region? Here in Hampton Roads, people live in one place, they work in another, their kids go to school in another, and then they go and they recreate in another community entirely. So getting a sense of kind of, how flooding may impact your access, your ability to get around. Those maps can help tell that story a little bit as well. But then once you figure out what your baseline level of risk is through that map, you answer a few questions about your specific property, what type of house it is it multifamily, single family, is it elevated, is it on a slab or on a crawl space, a few questions like that. And then at the end, you can adjust how much insurance coverage you might want to get an estimate of what your policy would actually cost you.
Now, when we talk about flood insurance, are you going to your local agent to purchase that, or are you having to go to another, federal entity? Where are you actually purchasing that type of product from?
Sure, that's a great question. So, once you get a sense of how much it's going to cost you, the first step, just call your insurance agent, whether it's State Farm or Allstate or USAA, Farmers, whoever use your homeowner's insurance or your renter's policy, holder. Just give them a call. They all service the NFIP policies. So actually the National Flood Insurance Policy in general does not actually service the policies. They farm that out through private insurance companies to actually write the policies, even though it's owned by the NFIP. The private insurance companies are the ones that actually do all the paperwork.
And I know that when in hurricane season, I know typically I think when a hurricane is a certain proximity out or when it's been named or whatever, the policies quit being written. When it comes to a flooding type event, not that we always can predict that this storm is going to create this type of flood. I mean, we've seen some catastrophic situations in the United States, not just in Hampton Roads, in recent years where it seemed like the storm just sits over a city and just rains until no tomorrow. And then they have a bigger mess than they've ever really calculated for. And certainly situations where, well, I've never flooded before, it's not really in question. It's really coming into play where people are experiencing that. But are there situations like that where those type of policies also don't get written when certain criteria are in place? I mean, are you aware of that, or just out of curiosity?
So you can get the policy written anytime, but
Okay.
there is a 30-day waiting period
Right,
for a
okay.
flood insurance
There you go.
policy. So you can't, if in this past storm that we just had come
Right.
through, you couldn't call up your insurance agent a week before and
Yeah.
say, I want a flood insurance policy.
Correct.
There would be a 30-day waiting period. And they do that because they don't want people to just sign up right
course.
before an event. So because that's part of just helping to maintain the program itself, sustainably into the future. So certainly, getting flood insurance, ahead of time.
Right.
And the thing here in Hampton Roads is that hurricane season is certainly part of what drives
Sure.
our risk of flooding here, but we see rain and we see storms
right.
year round here. So we amp up the outreach during hurricane season
Right.
because we want to complement the work that's coming out of the Weather Channel and FEMA and others about like the importance of understanding that we're in a kind of a tricky time of year when it comes to weather.
Correct.
But flood insurance is something that you should be thinking about year round.
Got it. What is the connection between the obvious other than community outreach, but with HRPDC and this program with the Get Flood Fluent? I mean, you guys aren't in the insurance business, so
Right.
it's not like that. But certainly looking at Hampton Roads as the region, I know that's certainly your perspective. But is that sort of where it fits in as far as why y'all were the ones kind of really spearheading this effort?
Sure. So we have a coastal resiliency program at the Planning District Commission, and so what we have been working on these issues related to flooding, hazard mitigation, sea level rise for more than a decade, for probably multiple decades on some of these issues of trying to help our localities put in place better policies, work together on some issues, and plan together when it makes sense. And in this case, one of the issues that has been identified is that we have relatively low penetration on flood insurance policies. And that's not just us, that's everywhere.
Right.
But we also know that flood insurance is the best way that individuals can protect themselves. A lot of we'd like to, ideally, we would protect areas from flooding with infrastructure or, not developing in certain vulnerable areas to begin with. That's not always possible.
Correct.
And in a lot of cases, it takes a lot of money, a lot of time to make that happen.
Right.
And so in the meantime, and certainly just to better protect individuals for their own specific individual private losses, the flood insurance policy is the best way to do that. And our chief administrative officers, so the city managers and county administrators throughout the region, pointed that out to us and said, this is one of the things that we want you to focus on as a program, as part of your regional program. And so we work with staff from each of the jurisdictions to craft this message, to put this out there. And we were lucky to get a grant from DCR to help put up the website and to do the initial push. But it's also something that we plan to keep doing every year, on into the future, because it's a message that, it's you can't say it enough.
No.
Get flood insurance.
That's right. Very simple message, but certainly very important. How long has this program been in place from y'all's perspective? I mean, when did y'all kind of start working on it to where we are today? You mentioned some of the newer enhancements to the website. I know we talked about a year or so ago, kind of then, but it had already been in play by that time already, I believe.
Yeah, so we let's see if I can think back. I think we first started working on this, on the whole program back in 2018 was when we first started working on the content. We rolled out the website in 2019. And this new calculator tool we rolled it out at the beginning of this year. Right. And I think we did the official kind of public launch, right. I want to say in June of this year. So it's something that we've been working on, but it's been public now for over a year. And it's a kind of a multimedia type of program where we do outreach. We have the website, which is like the kind of the core, and it's the clearinghouse for all this information. And then we also have we pay for radio ads and TV ads in some cases, and also some online digital ads as well. Sure. And then we do things like what I'm doing right now. But we try to reach people where they are,
right.
And through whatever means is cost effective for us.
Now, you mentioned as far as the low percentage of people in our area, and we're focused really on Hampton Roads and Suffolk, have certainly been included in there. What percentage is that approximately? Do we have a number to kind of throw at a dartboard on that?
Sure, it's not very high. I want to say it's roughly like maybe 10% or so.
Wow. Okay.
But I could get back to you on the numbers for that. That's one of the things that we've had a lot of challenges with is getting good data on how many people actually have flood insurance policies. And we know it's not very high. Right. But getting that data in real time and being able to use it to help make decisions about, what advertising works, what doesn't. Correct. That's something that we're struggling to work on. We want to have a better relationship with FEMA and with DCR on that. But for now, at least, it's a lot of, it's based on some decent data out there. But it would be nice to have something that's more timely, I guess, to help us really make the program that much better. But for now, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a hugely expensive program. Sure. So for what we've been able to accomplish so far, I think we're happy. But we're always looking for improvements on it.
What type of feedback have y'all received since the program kind of kicked off with regard to questions that you find? I guess, let's put it this way. What's the most typical question you get when you talk to someone about this and they go, boom, and they hit you with it? What is the question or questions that you continually hear from people when you start talking about flood insurance?
One of the questions that does pop up is, won't FEMA cover damage anyway if we have a hurricane?
Mm-hmm.
And the heartbreaking question or answer to that question is they won't in most circumstances. And even if there is a disaster declaration that would allow for some sort of grant from the federal government, it's not going to be very high. And so I think a lot of people, so that's one question that pops up a lot. I think the other issue that we run into is that people just don't know that they're in an area that can flood. And they think that the water is just going to go away. And I think what we've seen here in our region over the last several years with rainfall flooding is that if you get enough rain, it can flood anywhere.
That's right.
And unfortunately, and both on the south side, particularly after I think it was Hurricane Matthew came through, caused a lot of flooding that was all rainfall driven. There was very little of the storm surge that would blocked up the water a little bit, but that was a lot of rain, and that can be when people look at the map and they don't see themselves in the flood zone, they think that they're safe.
Correct.
And they're not necessarily safe from that kind of flooding.
Got it. So to recap again, getfloodfluent.org, I believe is the URL for that website. When people go on there for the first time, where would you say to really kind of direct their attention? You mentioned there's different facets of the site, and certainly it's not all just data. Again, try to have a little bit of fun or bring some levity to it, or at least the sense that people can enjoy going through it to kind of put in to see kind of what information they can glean from it. But where would you, if you were showing someone the website for the first time, where would you direct them to initially? What's a good starting point when you get there?
So I think, for people that are trying to just learn about flooding for the first time, flood risk and flood insurance, I would say take the quiz. That's the first thing that pops up on your computer screen or you're on your phone when you go to the website.
Right.
Is this option to take the quiz about flooding. And, we have, I think it's 10 questions long. Just go through and there are all sorts of questions about just kind of like, what you know about flooding. And we're not trying to make anybody feel bad about their lack of knowledge, but we know there's a lot of misconceptions out there about flooding and flood risk and flood insurance. And so using this quiz to kind of get people engaged in a friendly manner, because it's all about educating people. It's all about increasing knowledge. It's not about making anybody feel bad. If you don't have time to go through that and you don't want to just kind of play around and explore the website, on the right side there's what they call a hamburger button. Actually, it's the little 3 lines that you can click on, and that'll take you straight to some key questions, the kind of like the who, what, when, where, why about the program, and you can just and we have a bunch of these kind of FAQs that are listed there. So if you want to kind of dive into a specific question, that would be the way to go.
Got it. So again, big leave behinds from what we're talking about today. Certainly visit the website. That's really the impetus of what we're talking about today. And really, I guess, based on the data, no matter what result you come back with, perhaps sitting down with your insurance agent to talk with them about this is what I found, which again, as you said, they have access to some of the same data. So really you could come to a conversation and kind of be armed with some good information to share back and forth. And then kind of, as you said, from there, kind of maybe make your decision about, again, what insurance product will work best for you as far as level of coverage and things like that. Is that sort of the best approach and kind of leave behind that from what I was talking about today? That people
I would say, that you could call your insurance agent. In many cases, you could go online if you manage your policy through a website. You could just request a flood insurance quote, and they'll send you the beginnings of different levels of coverage and how they might cost.
Sure.
But if you start with the website and you have your insurance agent, you want to talk to them on the phone. Having that information so you can have an informed conversation is really helpful, I think, to getting people from where they are now, which is without flood insurance, to getting them with flood insurance. But I think the key takeaway that for this whole campaign of ours is that low risk does not mean no risk. And I think what we have seen in Hampton roads over the last several years is that people live in areas which are low risk for flooding, but they've still flooded anyway. And just because your neighborhood hasn't, in some ways, that's just down to luck. That's just chance that the weather, kind of the rain fell, here and not a mile away, and as a result, it caused flooding there and not in your neighborhood. And you can trust the chance, you can trust the luck, or you can protect yourself with flood insurance.
Yep. And remember, this is Hampton Roads, not Las Vegas. So
Right.
you want to mitigate that risk as much as possible and certainly be covered. God forbid a situation would occur again where
Right.
you need that type of coverage and that type of support. But Ben, appreciate everything today and the work that you and the HRPDC are doing to kind of get us to be flood fluent, and certainly the website that's out there. And I know we'll continue to look for new enhancements over the years as far as this program continues to roll out, and getting the information out there about people to really evaluate their situation and make that determination about flood insurance, both having it as well as what level kind of coverage they may need to protect themselves. Okay.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you again for your time. That would do it for this edition of On the Scene. I'm your host, Tim Kelly. We'll see you next time.